Thank you all for coming. My name is Robin Kirk. I'm the co-director of the Duke Human Rights Center here at the Franklin Humanities Institute. And I first wanted to thank the co-sponsors of this visit, which include the Duke Human Rights Center, the Duke Center for Middle Eastern Studies, the Forum for Scholars and Publics, the Focus Program, the International Comparative Studies Program, and the DeWitt Wallace Center, as well as the Program in Literature. The writer Marcello Di Cintio begins his new book, Pay No Heed to the Rockets, with a poem and an image, a girl in a green dress. The poem is Apology to a Faraway Soldier by Mourid Barghouti, the eminent Palestinian poet and novelist born near Ramallah and officially stateless since 1967. For Barghouti, quote, writing is a displacement from the normal social contract, a displacement from the common roads of love and enmity. The poet strives to escape from the dominant, used language to a language that speaks for the first time. If he succeeds in escaping and becomes free, he becomes a stranger at the same time. The poet is a stranger in the same degree as he is free. It is in this spirit that Marcello takes us on a different path into a conflict that for many has become cloaked in years of violence, misinformation, propaganda, and deadening familiarity. Places become their tragedies. Marcello calls that the, quote, cruel accounting of death and despair. The different path he chooses in this beautiful book is through the arts and that girl. Through the longing for beauty her image awoke in him, the desire to go beyond the cruel accounting and find the life and the art that stubbornly refuses to be shaped solely by conflict. This is not to say that art is somehow immune of the conflict. In crushing detail, Marcello also describes attacks and the difficulties, including one Israeli attack on the Sakakini Cultural and Arts Center outside Ramallah. Why destroy a center devoted to writing, concerts, and the arts? Quote, they wanted to give us a message that nobody is immune, the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish said. Marcello and I met in the most modern of ways online. I'll let him tell that story. What I will say is that the connection was literary and deeply personal, a way we both ended up seeing Palestine not through news reports and position papers, but through that same girl in a green dress that begins the book. Here's his beautiful description of the image that captivated both of us, taken during Israel's Operation Protective Edge in 2014. Quote, the girl, around 10 years old, wore a green dress and pink leggings, and her long hair was tied back in a neat ponytail. She pulled books from beneath shattered concrete and cinder blocks and stacked them in her arms. The books were tattered and filthy, their covers dangling from their bindings, but in the last photograph, the girl walked away smiling. Nothing is more beautiful than a story, Marcello writes. In this book, he takes us on a familiar journey, yet makes it deeply, wonderfully unfamiliar through his unflinching eye. An eye that takes in the pathos and the suffering and the complexity, as well as the exquisite persistence of life. Please join me in welcoming Marcello.
Yeah, I too want to start with thanking all the organizations that Dr. Kirk mentioned who sponsored my visit here to Duke. And especially I would like to thank Dr. Kirk herself. As she mentioned, in her introduction of me, we have a connection that I have this strange connection to Duke University and to Robin herself. It was exactly 4 years ago today that I found the photographs that Dr. Kirk had just described on your blog, and it was four pictures of this girl. Green dress, pink leggings, and each of them it was described pulling books out of the rubble. This was near this. We saw these photos after the end of the protective edge. It was a 50-day assault on Gaza, in which 1,500 Palestinian civilians died, including more than 500 children. And there was something remarkable about those 4 photos of the girl. And Dr. Kirk on the post, she kind of captioned those photos, and she wrote, "Of all the images of the destruction being visited upon Gaza and Israel, why did the picture of a girl retrieving her books from the rubble stop me cold?" And Dr. Kirk goes on to write, it's funny, you quoted me, I'm quoting you back. She wrote, "To find the photo's origin, I went through hundreds of ghastly images. Fathers screaming at the cameras, mothers collapsed. On the internet, people shout and shout and shout some more. The grief is unbearable. I mean, I cannot bear it. And so I continue my search for that simple photograph of that bookish girl." So I too was struck by those same 4 photographs, and they immediately informed the project that I was working on at that time, the project that would eventually turn into my new book, Pay No Heed to the Rockets. I traveled to Israel and Palestine several times over the past 20 years, and I'd written about Palestine many times as well for magazines. And a chapter in my previous book, there was a chapter in my previous book about Israel's wall around the West Bank. But I long wanted to write a full-length book about the Palestinians. And I recognize that the only story most outsiders usually hear about Palestine, especially here on this side of the ocean, is a story of the enduring conflict, right? We only know, there's only 2 kinds of Palestinian that we know. We know the young man with the keffiyeh over his face throwing stones at the soldiers. We also know the woman on her knees, wailing and crying in front of the rubble of her destroyed house. We have the Palestinians either a victim or a militant. There's the only 2 kinds of Palestinian that we see ever. But I wanted to find a way to write about the Palestinians in a different way, one where they weren't shackled to that same story, those same narratives of war and deprivation and trauma and all of that. And I figured that if I wanted to find new stories about Palestinians, I should seek out the storytellers themselves. So I traveled to Palestine, and I traveled to meet with the poets and novelists and short story writers. Surely they and the librarians and booksellers that care for and sell their books would have different stories to tell than the ones that I've heard so many times over and over again. That way, I thought that instead of beginning my conversations with Palestinians and by asking them about, say, humiliations they experienced at a checkpoint, I could ask them instead about the first poem they ever wrote. Instead of asking about their grandfather's olive orchards that they lost in 1948, I could ask instead about their father's library that they used to visit. In every case, politics was close to those conversations. The second or third question would lead to that. But at least it was a different way of starting. At least I could start with beauty instead of just struggle. So these writers were pulling stories from the detritus of war, just like the girl was. These writers were creating art out of tragedy in the same way that this girl in green dress and pink leggings was pulling books out of broken concrete. She became kind of the perfect symbol for the book that I wanted to write. And as Robin mentioned, the girl represented something else for me too. She made me long for beauty. If the only Palestinian we know is the militant or the victim, Palestine itself is known not for beauty but for ugliness. It's a place of despairing gray, broken only by the blood of fire and flames. But the girl in the photo was beautiful in the way all children are beautiful, and more beautiful still for the unexpected green of her dress against the grayness of rubble. So I set out to Palestine not just to find new stories, but to find beauty as well. And early on in the project, this girl was so much the engine driving the project that the book's original working title was "The Girl in the Green Dress," which I think my publishers preferred to this one. Although as I worked on the project, it became clear that even though the girl was part of the inspiration for the book, she was not so central to the story that she belonged as the title. I thought that would be misleading. So instead, I took the title of the book, Pay No Heed to the Rockets, from a poem by Palestine's most beloved writer, who Dr. Kirk mentioned in my introduction, Mahmoud Darwish. Now, Darwish, who died in 2008, was such an important figure in Palestinian culture that his ghost sort of hovered over every conversation that I had while in Palestine. Darwish was a rock star. His poetry readings would fill soccer stadiums. At one point, he was the best-selling poet in France. He's only the second Palestinian ever to be granted a state funeral, Yasser Arafat being the first. He's almost like a saint to the Palestinians. And one of my favorite passages from his work comes from his book called Memory for Forgetfulness, which was a memoir of living in Beirut in 1982 during the Civil War. And early in the book, he includes this long meditation about getting up in the morning and brewing coffee while the war rages outside. And Darwish was an incredible coffee snob, which made me respect him even more. He was obsessed about coffee. In fact, when his heart finally gave way, the coffee may have had something to do with it. But in 1982, this is part of what he wrote about brewing coffee in wartime. Gently place 1 spoonful of the ground coffee, electrified with the aroma of cardamom, on the rippling surface of the hot water. Then stir slowly, first clockwise, then up and down. Add the second spoonful and stir up and down, then counterclockwise. Now add the third. Between spoonfuls, take the pot away from the fire and bring it back. For the final touch, dip the spoon in the melting powder, fill and raise it a little over the pot, then let it drop back. Repeat this several times until the water boils again and a small mass of the blonde coffee remains on the surface, rippling and ready to sink. Don't let it sink. Turn off the heat and pay no heed to the rockets. I love that passage because it talks, not just because of the obsession for preparing his coffee, but the idea that you get up in the morning and create something that you love, and you have to pay no heed to the rockets. War may be raging outside, but what's more important, that this coffee is perfect. And I felt that was a great metaphor for the book that I was trying to write. Darwish creates art by ignoring for a moment the war raging outside, which is what all the Palestinian poets and writers that I talked to did. They created art in the midst of a great struggle. But of course, Darwish was being ironic, I think. You can't pay no heed to the rockets. You can't ignore explosions and war. In fact, one of Darwish's colleagues, Ghassan Zaktan, during that same war, had his apartment building destroyed by a rocket and lost almost all the copies of his first book of poetry in this explosion. So you can't ignore the rockets. And I feel that is part of what I was trying to do too in this book, is say that even though Palestinians, the writers, will strive for beauty in their work, they still live in a place where rockets will explode. They still live in a place where struggle is real and hot and always. So, like I said, my idea was to go and learn about Palestine and hear new Palestinian stories from the storytellers themselves and see Palestine through the lens of literary culture. So my plan was I was going to travel around and meet with writers who were living at the time. Aside from Darwish and a couple of others, I was focusing on living writers. So I made 3 trips for this book. I traveled to the West Bank, to Gaza. I visited with Palestinians living in Israel and briefly went to Beirut. And I met all kinds of writers. I met men and women, old and young. I met angsty teen poets and grumpy old short story writers, some grumpy young poets too. And so tonight, for the rest of my time up here, I want to share a few of those stories with you of the people that I met. I spent a lot of time in Ramallah, as one does when they're in Palestine. Ramallah is this arguably the center of Palestinian culture, at least contemporary Palestinian culture. I spent a lot of time hanging out with writers in cafes and smoking water pipes and drinking endless cups of coffee. Some that Darwish would have enjoyed, others not so much. Watching men smoke countless cigarettes. But one of my favorite kind of characters, or one of the favorite writers that I got to meet was a woman named Maya Abu Hayat. I met her in Ramallah. Now, Maya was always wanted to write stories as a little girl. She told me that she used to write stories to make grown-ups love her. And that's how she would get hugs. If she wrote a beautiful story, her mother would give her a hug, and this is why she would write. Her teachers would love her for her stories. When she was quite young, her parents divorced. She lived with her father in exile in Tunisia and Jordan. And after the Oslo Accords, they moved to Nablus in the West Bank, which she said all her father ever wanted was to live in some dumpy apartment in Palestine, in Nablus, and that's where they ended up. On the first day, Maya grew up mostly in Nablus. And on the first day of the Second Intifada, she was in college at the time, and her boyfriend was killed on the first day. And it was shocking for her. There was a curfew. She couldn't go to the hospital to say goodbye. She couldn't go with him, and so he died. And Maya responded to that tragedy, both her personal tragedy of losing the man that she loved, and also this kind of wider tragedy of the Intifada around her. She sought solace in religion. She put on the hijab. She went to mosque. She stopped shaking hands with men. She became a devout Muslim, which her family never was, and her father was quite suspicious of her newfound faith. But this is what she did. She tried to find solace in religion, but it didn't work for her. It didn't work at all. What she ended up finding solace for, how she managed to deal with her grief, was to write. And she wrote her first novel, kind of inspired by her boyfriend's killing. And when the novel was done, so was her hijab. She tossed her hijab away, was done with devout faith, and moved to Ramallah and became a writer. She, in addition to writing novels for adults, she's a beautiful poet. She's an actor. I used to see her on mobile phone commercials, and she's a star of the annual Ramadan soap operas. You'll always see Maya on the screen. But a lot of the things that she writes for children. She writes beautiful children's books, and she does storytelling workshops with refugee kids in the camps. And she told me that these kids that she meets in refugee camps and in rural villages are hard, serious kids. They want to participate in the struggle, even as young children. Maya said they want to throw stones, to fight, to be a hero. Maya's workshops with them, though, are silly and ridiculous, and she makes funny noises, and they tell funny stories. And they help, these workshops coax a little bit of silliness from these very serious, somber children to help them laugh and act like kids, even for just a little while. This is Maya's goal, is to make kids feel like kids, even for an afternoon. One of the other writers that I met, who I enjoyed my time with, was a young man named Mohammad Al Kurd. And Mohammad was 17, I believe, when I met him. Now, his mother, when Muhammad was a little boy, a small child, she used to write poems for a Jerusalem newspaper. And she would every morning she'd read them out loud to Muhammad's father, kind of seeking his feedback before she'd send them to her editor. And Muhammad would wake every morning listening to the sound of his mother's verses kind of echoing from the kitchen. This is where he first kind of, he said, that's how I became familiar with the way rhythm and rhyme float in a poem. When Muhammad was 10, living in East Jerusalem, a group of radical Israeli settlers broke into his family's house and took half of it over. They threw the furniture out on the front yard and burned it. The Al Kurds had lived there for 50 years and built the back half of the house, but the front half of the house had stood on land that was owned by Jews and was built without a permit. It was owned by Jews before 1948 and was built without a permit. So by law, these Israelis took it over. Yeah, so Muhammad describes watching as they torched his 3-year-old sister's bed, warmed themselves around the fire. And when I met Mohammad, 8 members of his family were still living in the back extension of the house, while a kind of a rotating group of settlers lived in the front. And these settlers have spat on the Al Kurds. They throw their trash there. They would stand naked in front of the windows and make obscene gestures to the women in Muhammad's family, so that they had to hang sheets over the windows so they didn't see these men. They had a dog that was so vicious it would bark, and it scared Muhammad's sister so much that she would wet her pants every time she saw this dog. Muhammad originally wanted to be a lawyer to help people like his family, and instead he became a very talented poet. And his poetry not only challenges the humiliations of the Israeli occupation, but the problems inherent in his own society. And this was really interesting about Muhammad. His poetry celebrates feminism, and it celebrates women's rights, and it criticizes kind of the traditional masculinity that leads to misogyny in his own culture. He's in a university now in Savannah, Georgia, writing this kind of poetry, very, very fiery, very, very based in human rights. But my favorite piece of his writing, I think, was an ode he wrote to his favorite aunt, Maisa, who died in 2014. And Muhammad wrote, "She was a goddess, hiding and covering every fragile piece of her soul beneath thundery laughs, red lipstick, pearls, and sassiness. No outer power was able to touch her, not divorce, not notoriety, and not whispers from covered women on the bus. I used to think of her as a superwoman, the woman who taught me everything I know about confidence and self-love. Indestructible and astonishingly careless, she seemed. The closest to freedom one could get in an occupied country. The way she loved was generous. The way I loved was ordinary." Like I said, Muhammad's in the United States now doing poetry readings all around the country. I kind of followed up with him before he moved to the States and asked him if he would miss Jerusalem, and he said he wouldn't. But after a few months at college, he posted an entry on his blog, and he called it "On Missing Jerusalem," and it includes descriptions of the birds in Jerusalem and bus stops, his mother's jasmine, his father's stubbornness, and his little sister's dancing in front of the mirror. I think Muhammad misses Jerusalem more than he lets on. Another young writer I had the great pleasure of meeting was a Bedouin girl named Sahla Hamdeen. She lives in a Bedouin camp called Wadi Abu Hindi, which is kind of always at risk of being bulldozed by the Israeli authorities because they're not legally, they shouldn't legally be there according to the Oslo rules. None of the buildings in Wadi Abu Hindi are permanent. They live in shipping containers, and the school is made out of like bamboo mats. They're not allowed to build anything permanent. But Salah wrote a fairy tale when I think she was 16 years old, and it was about a girl named Sahla, and who also lived in Wadi Abu Hindi, whose father was also in prison. But the Sahla of the book had a secret. She had a secret way to escape Wadi Abu Hindi and the pressures of kind of the Israeli army that were around them all the time. She had a flying sheep as a pet, and his name was Hantouche. And in the story, Sahla she gets on Hantouche's back and rides to Barcelona because she wants to meet the soccer player Messi, who she adores Messi. So she flies to Barcelona and meets Messi. They play soccer together. Hantouche plays in goal. And then eventually, all the three of them fly back to Wadi Abu Hindi, where Messi helps her build a stadium, and Wadi Abu Hindi hosts the World Cup. It's a lovely little story. It won an international prize for kids fairy tale writing prize. And when I met with her, she was a little bit older. I think she was closing on 18 when I met her. She still had some Barcelona football bracelets around her wrist, which I was happy to see that she was still a fan. And as I was talking to her, she wasn't responding to my questions very much. She was very quiet. I thought, well, maybe she's shy. And then I thought, maybe she's bored. And then she said something near the end of our conversation that really struck me. She said that ever since she had won this prize, journalists like me were coming and interviewing her. And she had hoped that because of this attention that she brought to Wadu Abu Hindi, something would change. Things would change for their community. And she didn't want much. She wasn't expecting her fairy tale would turn into this independent state of Palestine. She didn't think that her fairy tale would somehow have her father released from prison. All she wanted was the soccer field at the camp to be cleared of stones, and for the goalposts to be made upright instead of, because they slanted. She wanted proper goalposts and a soccer field clear of stones, and even that the attention couldn't bring them. And it was moments like that that kind of, as a writer, it humbles you as a writer when you realize that people are generous with their stories. They'll tell you things, but what you're giving back is sometimes not very much. And it was a very humbling moment. I wasn't only interested in the writers and of the books. I was sometimes interested in the books themselves. Sometimes books as physical objects in Palestine were sacred, even if they weren't like Qurans and Bibles. There was something sacred about the books, individual books in particular. I remember I wrote a little bit about this fat textbook called All That Remains, which listed and described the hundreds of Palestinian villages that were lost in 1948, and how this one historian and his crew of grad students went out and collected all this information in this fat volume, which is a remarkable text. I wrote about how in 1948. Kind of Israeli soldiers and librarians collected books from the libraries of Palestinians who were fleeing their homes, and it was turned into a fascinating documentary. This event, and there's was it a robbery of books, or was it a rescue of these books? So I got a chance to meet with an Israeli librarian at the National Library to talk about this collection of books and what that means to the Palestinians. But the most kind of interesting library story I had was in Nablus, where in the municipal library in Nablus, kind of their main library, there's a room on the second floor that's set aside for the books that were collected from 2 prisons that were shut down in the 90s. And so these were the books that Palestinian prisoners were reading, and they were all collected and put into this one room. And they were mostly First Intifada prisoners. So the books were like from the mid-'80s and earlier. And it's remarkable to see kind of into the minds of the prisoners of the time. The First Intifada was fought by Marxists and these secular fighters and these intellectuals and all they had books about the Soviet Union and about socialist economics. They had books by books that portrayed kind of Palestine's enemies in a negative light. They had books about how America's mistreatment of their native peoples, for example. There was one book I saw. It was songs written for Nelson Mandela, and it was Arabic on one side of the page and English on the other side of the page. And written in pencil over the Arabic side were kind of the emphasis markings, which suggested that these prisoners were actually singing these songs in prison, and Mandela would have been a prisoner at the same time. So there's this beautiful image of these political prisoners in Palestine singing for their colleague in South Africa. But the coolest thing that I saw, the librarian calls me over, and she hands me this thick textbook, and I open it up, and the prisoners had cut a hole. And it was used to smuggle things back and forth. But what it smuggled was notes. What the prisoners used to do, they used to write like long kind of socialist manifestos, or rewrite books by socialist authors, or write love notes to their family outside of the prison, or whatever they did. And they would take the cigarette wrappers and the foil that's around in the inside of a cigarette package. They would peel the paper from the foil. And that paper was what they would use to write on. And they would write with the deftest, tiniest hand in this kind of micro microfilm almost size of text, and they would hide those in this book and pass it around the prison. And they had the way to clip it closed so that even if a prison guard flipped through it, he wouldn't open it all the way to get to the book. And in this book, it actually had some of those messages still remaining. I was told a story by one of the ex-prisoners of one of the prisons whose books were collected in that library. How that wasn't the only way they would transmit books. They would take the paper, roll it up, wrap it in the plastic from the cigarette lighter, melt it, and swallow it, or put it up from behind, he was told me. And this is how, when prisoners were transferred, they would transfer messages back and forth, either by, inside their bodies. And I thought it was so interesting, this idea of words being contraband. It wasn't little baggies of cocaine and weapons they were smuggling back and forth. It was manifestos and notes for family and words. Words were contraband at the time. The end of my book, the end of my travels in Palestine were into Gaza, where I was there, almost 3 years ago today. I was in Gaza, which is a remarkable place, as you can imagine, where you have Palestinians not just dealing with a blockade by the Israelis, but the oppressive rule of Hamas, and then in kind of these regular military assaults. I mean, Gazans have suffered 3 major military operations in the last 3 years: 2008, 2012, and 2014. I met 10-year-old children who had experienced 3 wars. But the most remarkable writers in Gaza, I remember a young woman, Rana Mortaja, another teenager, who published her stories on her Facebook page. Lacking any other kind of publication outlets, she published stories on Facebook. Maybe her opposite was a gentleman named Garib Asqalani, who was close to in his 70s for sure, who wrote these beautiful short stories about a time before the blockades, when Israelis and Palestinians, while not at peace, did work together and knew each other and had developed proper family relationships with each other, a sort of relationship that no longer exists between Gazans and Israelis. I met a woman, one of the only openly religious women I met during my travels. It was a woman named Najla Atala, who I met in her house with her husband, and they'd just been married the year before, and she was pregnant and so excited. But she writes these surprisingly erotic stories where she talks about her intimate body and sexuality in a way that I didn't expect from a devout Muslim woman in Gaza. It was really remarkable. But I think my favorite character in Gaza, or one of my favorite characters, was a man named Jamal Abu Al-Khamsan, who was like a theater director and an actor. But he ran what was called the Gallery Cafe, which was this vast outdoor cafe that attracted all of Gaza's writers and musicians and artists and poets, and everyone would gather and share work and play music and debate poetry and give poetry readings. It was one of the only places in Gaza where men and women could mix. They weren't separated in the cafe. And as such, because it was kind of this chaotic art space, Hamas was not a fan. And so Jamal's story of Gallery Cafe is this ongoing battle with these poorly disguised Hamas operatives who would come and try to shut the place down all the time. And he tells this one story where the Hamas shows up at the cafe and accuses him of hosting this graffiti exhibition without permits, which was kind of a nonsense accusation. And they end up dragging him down to the police station and questioned him about his contacts and whether if he's having sex with the women on the phone, like his phone numbers he has and all this stuff. They accuse him of these things and send him home. They tell him to come back the next day. He comes back again with the same interrogation. Comes back a third day, and Jamal has got a bit of a smart mouth, and the Hamas officials, the police, kind of accelerate the their interrogation, and they beat him across his butt with a cane. And Jamal tells a story, and he laughs when he tells a story. And in fact, he said he laughed during the beating, because he knew that now that the police were in trouble, because by beating him, they had acted well beyond their authority. So what he did, he left the prison, freshly beaten, and he says he called all of his international media friends that he knew in Gaza, all these journalists and filmmakers, and he said, "Meet me at Gallery Cafe in 2 hours," because he knew in 2 hours the bruises on his ass would start to really color. And so he shows up to Gallery Cafe with the assembled journalists, and he says, "I've called you here to photograph my ass." And he turns around, drops his pants for the reporters who take his picture and then report on this beating across the world. Jamal shows up for his 4th interrogation the next day, and the police are furious, but they fired the guy who beat him, and they let him go, and they told him just to be careful from now on. He won that battle, Jamal, but he did not win the war. Eventually, Hamas bulldozed half of the cafe, suggesting they were going to build a cancer hospital in that space, and then they bulldozed the rest of it. And when I visited, there was no cancer hospital in that space. But Jamal has rebuilt, and there's a Gallery Cafe still exists on the beach in Gaza. He says, "You know how some people are drug addicts? Because I'm a Gallery Cafe addict. He won't stop building this place, which is so important to the Gazans." Talking about Gaza kind of brings me to where I started, with the girl in the green dress. Also on Dr. Kirk's website, I'm quoting you again, she writes, "I want to know the girl's name. I want to know she's okay. I want to know what was so important about those books, those specific books, and why she searched the rubble for them. I want to sit next to her and watch her turn the pages and tell me what's on them is funny or interesting or completely boring or silly." So I too wanted to know the girl's name and wanted to know if she's okay. So I went to find her. I tracked down the photographer who took the original photos. First, I asked Dr. Kirk, and she didn't know where the photos came from. I tracked down the original photographer, who is this remarkable man who lost both his legs in a previous war in Gaza, and does all his photography from a wheelchair, and has this amazing SUV that he's rigged so he can drive it with just his hands. He's a remarkable man. So he remembered, I got in touch with him, and he remembered the girl. He said she had beautiful eyes. He said he remembered her very clearly. And he remembered that she lived in a refugee camp. So one day he picked me up from my apartment, and we drove to the refugee camp. Myself, the photographer, Momin, his name, and my translator, Lara. And we get to the Nusrat refugee camp, and she points to the rubble where the rubble that she was pulling books out of at the time was the neighborhood mosque that had been destroyed. And he said, "I took her picture here, so let's find her." And so we went around asking every man we saw, showed the picture, those 4 photographs showed her, "Do you know this girl? Do you know this girl?" And eventually people started pointing to us towards a house, and knock on the door, and the door opens, and it's her. And it was a remarkable moment in that, and she had so much poise. I mean, she opens the door, and all of a sudden there's some foreigner, a legless photographer in a wheelchair, and a young Gazan woman. And if the girl was startled, she did not show it. The girl's name is Maram Al-Assar, and she's okay. I was happy to report, at least as okay as a young girl living in a Gaza refugee camp can be. As I mentioned, the books in the photo that she was pulling from the rubble were from the mosque down the street where she lives. And she told me how it was during one afternoon, during a brief lull in the bombing, she walked out to get some fresh air, and she saw on the ground pages blowing in the wind, and there were pages from the Holy Quran, she said. And so she said, "These shouldn't be on the ground." So she followed this trail of pages until she got to the mosque, and pulled all the books from the area of the mosque where the library was collapsed, and she was pulling these books out. That's where the photos were from. She told me how she used to go to the library all the time, and not just to read religious books, but they had other books there, and she studied biology there. And she would bring her mother there and read to her too, because her mother didn't read very well. And it was It was a place that was close to her. She told me too that her family was from Julis. It was a village lost in 1948. And before we left Maram, she recited a few lines from a poem for me. A poem called "We Shall Return." It's a famous poem about how Palestinians will one day return to those villages like Julis. One of the lines, "We'll return and kiss the moist ground," the poet writes, "love flowering on our lips." Of course, you know, I'm not sure if Maram will ever see Julis, but as you know, my book ends with that visit with Maram and her family, and so I'm going to end my talk today with a little bit of that. I'm going to read the book's final few paragraphs, even though my publisher says never to do that. But here's the end of the book, and it ends where tonight began. Maram's family will never return to Julis. Nothing is left to return to. The Israeli army reduced the village to stones after 1948. But the end of Julis is not the end of Maram's Nakba story. For Palestinians, the Nakba is not a historical event that happened 70 years ago. In 2008, 3 months before he died, Darwish wrote, "The Nakba is not a memory. It is a continuous uprooting that makes Palestinians more worried about their existence. The Nakba continues because the occupation continues. Continuing occupation means the continuation of the war. The Nakba is an unfinished novel, 3 generations long and counting, with no ending. It is the poem that never ends, persisting and pressing forward. Of all the things I learned in Palestine, this felt among the most important. During my time among the readers and writers of Palestine, I found no life undarkened by the Nakba and the conflict it continues to bear. Yet I found no life wholly defined by the conflict either. Palestinians may long for a justice long denied them, but they also long to marry and to see their children marry. Palestinians want to see Paris. Teenagers blast their ears with pop music. Boys kick footballs on beaches with their cousins and try to catch the eye of the pretty girl in their Arabic literature class. Palestinians star in cell phone commercials and on cooking shows. They coach basketball. Sometimes they write poems. The Palestinians live complete lives in their disputed space, regardless of all they've lost and continue to lose. I also learned that beauty flashes brighter in the blackness of this loss. Cruelty's shadow amplifies Palestinian humanity like the green of a girl's dress against the background of gray. As I left Gaza and Palestine, by passing back through the crossing's cold steel, I thought about how much I will miss the brightened beauty of this place. The way the fragrance of jasmine intensifies at dusk, the blood-red sunsets, the green neon on the minarets, and the calls to prayer they radiate over the hills, the smell of sage in every cup of tea, the way every Palestinian who enters the cafe bids everyone inside, "Assalamu alaikum," peace be unto you, the wedding bands that play from the back of moving flatbed trucks, falafel for breakfast, walking beneath the mulberry trees and mashing the fruit beneath my sandals, zatar and labna and paying a single shekel for 6 warm rounds of pita, the gratitude Palestinians express for my willingness to come and see this place for myself. I found a story in every crack of this place. Stories about how taxi drivers who ply the Ramallah-Jericho road die young. They spend years traveling back and forth from the heights of Palestine's hills to the depths of the Jordan Rift Valley near the Dead Sea, and the constant altitude change stresses their hearts. About professors in a Gazan medical college who began to worry when too many students were recognizing the cadavers provided for their anatomy classes. The college arranged for the students to study anatomy at a school in Cairo where they are less likely to face their own relatives on the dissecting table. About a cobbler in Hebron who adds a pinch of dirt from the nearby hills to the soles of the shoes he makes. That way, no matter where his customers go, they will always walk upon the soil of their homeland. Thank you very much.
It was really a lovely talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Although it's not it's a depressing subject. I'm a distant observer of this and have heard many things about this situation. It seems to be getting worse. I don't see anybody saying that anything's getting better. I'm just curious about where you think this is going, and maybe what, other than poetry, which I'm sure is very important to the people, what do you think is needed by the world community? Although I have some thoughts about that, but just curious to know what you're feeling, since you've been there several times, how you think it's going, and what is needed.
I'm gonna be there on Friday, and that'll be my 10th time. And I agree. It's every time I go, things seem a bit worse. You know, the first time I was there was in 1999, and although things weren't going well, the second Intifada hadn't started. There seemed to be more optimism, or at least a general sense of optimism. I'm not sure if anything was optimism about anything in particular. But no, you're right. I feel that things are worse now than they've ever been. And I asked Palestinians exactly that question that you asked me. Like, what do you want from the rest of the world? And more often than not, they say not a damn thing. I've heard that several times, and I'm not even sure what that answer means. I'm not sure if that answer meant, because left alone seems to, or that they don't have no expectations anymore. After all this time, they have no expectations that the world community is gonna bring them anything. The sense that whatever solution comes from them themselves. Maybe that's what they're asking. At the same time, and I mentioned, I just touched on it in those very last paragraphs. If you've ever traveled there, the Palestinians are intensely grateful for you to be a witness. They don't just welcome you, they thank you for coming, and not in the way that we all thank someone for coming. It's the idea of like, thank you for seeing this with your own eyes, and please relay our stories back to wherever you come from. So maybe that's what we can do, is tell those stories, or to go and see it for ourselves. Beyond that, I don't know. I mean, if I was joking with someone earlier today, if I knew the answer to those questions, I would be accepting my Nobel Peace Prize right now and not talking to you, lovely people. But it's hard to know what the world community should be doing. The world community has a short attention span. I talk to people in Gaza, say the only time the world notices what's happening to us is when there's bombs being dropped on us, and in between the fire. People forget the world forgets that we're here. They almost complain, and not complain's not the word, but they talk about the war in Syria, how the war in Syria has drawn the world's attention. It's like the Middle East, the world can only focus on one problem in the Middle East at a time, and it's Syria now. And the idea was, until Syria is fixed, no one's going to pay attention to what's happening to us here.
I guess I'm wondering, you had mentioned this earlier with the students, but I wanted to invite you to talk about it, that the reason why you wanted to write this book was to tell these stories and to focus on these storytellers. But you also talked a little bit about the trepidation you had about entering into this particular, maelstrom of meaning. And I just wanted to invite you to talk a little bit about just what it's like to be not an activist and to not take sides. And I think Tim was sort of saying, what can be done, but also that that's not your goal
right.
as a writer. And I just wanted to invite you to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, it's been interesting. A friend of mine, another writer in Canada, had written a book a few years ago about Palestine. And when I told her I was thinking of doing the same, her advice to me was don't. It's a maelstrom. Entering that conversation is not easy. And I found that, and so I didn't know what to expect when writing this book. I didn't know what to expect as a response to it. I felt that because I come off, the book is sympathetic towards the Palestinian side of the conflict. I felt that those who were sympathetic to the other side would criticize it. And for the kind of 2 years that I was working on this book, I kind of would always mentally rehearse my responses to questions I could imagine getting, criticism that I could imagine receiving. But so far, the greatest criticism I've had, and now this book's only been out for a few months in Canada, and even shorter here in the States. But the biggest criticism I've had was from the Palestinian activist crowd. the people that I thought were going to be my readers, which I naively thought were going to be my crowd. And the fact is, the book is not activist enough. It wasn't enough for these folks that I was celebrating Palestinian culture and being sympathetic towards their side of a conflict. I wasn't coming hard enough down on the Israelis. I wasn't using words. I was using words like war and conflict and struggle instead of words like genocide and apartheid and massacre. It seems like there's no room for nuanced language. There's no neutral space to occupy. And unless I was going to wave the flag and march on the page, they weren't interested. And I was naively surprised by that, and yeah, and a little disappointed, I think. I'm sure I'll get it from the other side eventually. No doubt, but I was surprised that it was the Palestinian activists that did not appreciate my take on things.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.